Okay, so I'm Larry Tranel. We're going to talk about managing farm stress and distress. And in fact, we've had a lot presentations and just a lot of farm press out there about the stress. And we want to kind of try to move it a little bit further down the road, a little bit more in depth into what happens with distress, with the whole goal of helping us to pursue brain health and also behavioral well-being on the farm. So when we take a look at COVID, the changes, the social interactions, I mean, we can take a look at happy, forward-looking people, or we can be pretty defensive, and how we take a look at that protective mode. And I want to talk about that protective mode actually quite a bit today, just because I think that protective mode kind of causes us to kind of get stuck in a rut sometimes and not be able to move forward quite as fast. We realize that a lot of layers of stress, it kind of compounds the issue, but what's the emotion behind the mask? And even without COVID, what's behind the mask in those emotions and the thought processes that we have? So when we take a look at stress, I want us to maybe change our thought process about stress, what stress actually is, because everybody talks about stress being so bad, okay? So I want you to think about just the word stressed. If you spell that thing backwards, what do you get? Yes, a very positive thing called desserts, okay? So I'm not saying all the sugars and the carbs in this thing are a positive thing, but it's a positive thought process of what desserts are. And so sometimes when we think about things that we get stressed about, how can we simply realize that maybe that stress is actually kind of a blessing or something positive happening within our lives, and maybe we don't recognize it at the time, but maybe it is a backwards blessing. And so again, try to rename stress into something more positive. So how we think about stress and how we handle stress is often more important, believe it or not, than the stress itself. So a 30,000 person study showed that there's a 43% increase in dying from stress, but only for those reported being under stressed. So those that didn't think that stress was bad, there wasn't a difference. And I think that's a huge thing for us to think about. If we don't think of stress as bad, it really doesn't impact us near as much. So simply believing that stress is bad for us increases the risk of ill health and even death. So my fear with all the things that are happening in the press and talking about mental health and things like that for farmers, that farmers think that stress is bad because that's what we tell them. And they actually sometimes tend to have an increased emotionality to stressful events. And just reading the media, because we know what the news sources just do to us. And so that same thing can happen. If we tell farmers they should be under more stress, they might be under more stress because of it. So those who think stress is bad, they have increased heart rate, which when we experience a lot of emotions, we tend to get an increase in heart rate, but we also have blood vessel constriction, and that's not good. Okay, and that's the part that worries us. But those who think that stress is good, we still have the increased heart rate, but the blood vessels stay relaxed, just as if we're experiencing joy and courage, coming from a comment from Kelly McGuganall, Stanford University psychologist. So again, thinking of stress as good is a pretty important piece. So acknowledging stress as good is good. The stress, not so good, and we'll talk about that. So we're going to talk about the tale of two minds. We have this protective mind and we have this higher reasoning type mind. So when things happen and we need to kind of protect ourselves, we get in this fight or this flight mode, this fear mode, volatility, withdrawal. It's kind of a personality type thing as well. So what you gonna do when stress comes for you? You're gonna fight, you're gonna flight, or are you gonna put your mind in this higher reasoning type mode to think through this a little bit better? So let's step back, that the mind that wins is the mind that one feeds. So this primitive mind, it magnifies risk. It puts us in this protective mode where things like hesitation and guilt, shame, fear, these short-term impulses, and anything that can help us protect with emotions are often negatively exhibited. So those emotions by themselves are definitely not bad. They're there for a reason. They're actually quite good. But it's the thought process that we can't think through them and we can't overcome them. And we get caught in a rut, or we just can't move beyond them. So as we start taking a look at that prefrontal cortex, instead of that primitive mind, our higher reasoning mind, because when we are in that protective mode, this higher reasoning mind also gets cut off from operating all unnecessary function, and it makes us really focus on that threat when our mind is in protective mode and we can't get to that next stage of the higher reasoning. So the solution to distress is often minds apart, and I say that very literally. So the tale of two minds, when we have any kind of a mental risk where somebody says something to us, we go in protective mode, or there's a physical risk where there might be a fight or some arguing or something like that, we go into this protective mode. Okay, so it's an instinct. We've had this brain for millions and millions of years, and we're a product of it. So we go into that protection mode to protect ourselves. So we focus overwhelmingly, and sometimes, yes, we actually get overwhelmed by the risks. We refrain from this higher purpose reasoning, as I mentioned, and it's often what I call a self-defeating behavior, because it self-defeats our good behaviors that we should be going after, again, because we're stuck. And research will also show that we avoid pain much more than seeking better gain. So again, that protective mode is pretty strong in our minds. So how can we use the best of both worlds, or the best of both minds? Because inside our mind, there's our internal conflict. The prefrontal cortex wants to move away from this and get going, and this protective mind is really holding us back. Okay, so I tend to say that we can actually hack our minds, or we can hijack our minds, or we can trick our minds to better deal with stress in our higher reasoning ability. So one of the things we can do, and just to try to think of it, if I get under a lot of stress, or I actually use an example, when I'm reffing a basketball game and everybody's yelling at me and I start getting protective mode that I mess up that call, is that I'll start counting 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, because I'm trying to trigger my higher reasoning mind instead of trying to get caught up in the emotions of the moment. Or even tougher is to go Z, Y, X, W, B, because that's not natural for me. I have to think about it to try to gear and trick my mind to go to the higher reasoning one versus the protective one. The same thing can happen when we get into different types of situations. So this graph is one that I just really like to show, because again, there is such a thing as called good stress. And there's a lot of good stress out there. That good stress causes us to have some arousal. It increases our performance and basically can help us, take a healthy tension. And actually, as we take a look at, think of this as maybe as a rubber band, there's healthy tension that's an act of stretching. It's an act of growing who we are as people. Okay, the second part of that is once it gets beyond that comfort zone and it gets into fatigue and exhaustion, okay, then it's to the point where it's straining and we actually have a breakdown, or it's a breakage type thing. So again, the good stress, we need to think of it. It's healthy for us to think of it that way, but in distress, we definitely need to take care of ourselves as well. So the tip is that some stress is good, too much is not. But that comfort zone that we live in also has a wide range. And it's this thing called resiliency, is that we can actually stretch our comfort zone beyond where it might be by learned skills and mindset tactics that can help us actually become more resilient to stress within our lives and be able to handle more of it if that's what we want. So in that human function curve, we are always told that we need to think outside the box. Okay, and yes, we need to think outside the box of that primitive mindset and that protective mode that we get ourselves into. So the goal is optimal human performance in that comfort zone. It might not be at one's highest performance level, okay, but we can definitely push ourselves beyond for higher performance. But what happens? The cost of that is often living beyond the margins. And so I want you to think about your own life, about how you live beyond the margins of time, how you live beyond the margins of energy, and even just our focus of multitasking, too many things to do, because that truly impacts our brain health. And if we live beyond the margins in our relationships and our self-care and many other things as well, nutrition, whatever, it really impacts our behavioral health. And that brain health and behavioral health are so intertwined with each other. So we need to operate inside the box of our comfort zone and within the margins, but as we try to think outside the box. So the neuron code. So if we change our thought, it's going to change our neuron codes. It's going to change our emotions. So this to the right is the pictures of our brains with different types of emotions, like surprise and fear, or what a neutral one without any emotion might actually look like. So we have a lot of these codes within our brain. So the big key and the big word is reinterpret. That families or individuals who reinterpret initial negative situations, one of these emotions, to something with more positive meaning, a more positive emotion, are more likely to do these things, to be in control of their stressors, to find possible solutions to crisis situations, and to adapt well eventually to a crisis. Okay, so the whole goal is how do we reinterpret, hijack, whatever we need to do to change our thought process. So I want to talk about what I call emotions that have negative consequences to us. So disgust, and you can see some of these emotions on these faces here, what a look of distrust would be, and what a frown would look like, okay? Because those are three pretty important ones. So when we have disgust and we have that facial reaction, there's actually a hormone that gets released called cortisol, which is actually kind of a stress hormone, okay? And too much of it is not a good thing, okay? So it changes our attitude towards the source of where we came, and typically it changes our behavior as well. And so if the source of that is another person, a spouse, a family member, an employee, okay, that can actually change that relationship in addition to that. So distrust, whether we don't trust the markets, the system, we don't trust ourselves or spouse or kids, other people to do the right things. Sometimes we carry this look of distrust around. Okay, again, cortisol. Okay, it's a negative emotion, helps us try to deal with the stress, but too much of it is not a good thing. And then we have this thing called a frown. So one of the biggest facial expressions that is researched is the smile, and how impactful in a positive way that is to our mindset. When we start taking a look at frowns, it's almost the exact opposite, okay? How negatively impacts it has into our minds, but it also encourages difficulty in planning, communication, relationships, our decision-making as well. So bottom line is this quote, is that the way that we face stress can help us better face stress, okay? Our faces actually encourage it or discourage it. So if we look at a smiling face, be positive, like a proton. So I'm going to encourage us to do this with what I call Dr. Larry's BS Minute. So the BS stands for breathe and smile. So sit back in a relaxing position, stand, recline, or whatever you're doing, even if you have to continue working, just try to relax your mind just a tad little bit. With eyes open or closed, try to think of something positive. If you can't, it's still gonna work. Breathe in slowly to begin with. Fake smiling as you do, okay? Because it's gonna change the serotonin levels in your mindset. So breathe out slowly, fake smiling as you breathe out all the way to the bottom. And then chuckle. So just the impact of laughter in our lives is pretty important. So at the bottom of the breath, I'm gonna ask you to chuckle. You can try this as I'm speaking as well. It might be better if you're by yourself right now. So you're gonna repeat 2 through 6, breathing deeper and smiling wider each time, and then chuckling more each time for a total of 1 minute. So that by the time you're done, you're gonna have a very long indrawn breath and a very long exhaled breath, and try to hold it there a little bit and try to chuckle at the same time. So we realize that smiling and laughter, it also has a mimic reflection and it's contagious. So after we do this, people tend to report that they feel better and more relaxed, less stressed. The smiling continued shortly afterwards. And so if we want to try to continue our smiles, we need to practice it, having more energy and more enthusiasm afterwards. And who doesn't want that? So frowning was actually more difficult. The people I tested this on shortly afterwards. And if you don't get that, try doing the exercise again and then try to frown after you just smiled for a minute. Facial disgust was more difficult afterwards. So again, if you didn't feel that, do it again and see if you can have that facial disgust, because those negative reactions on your face are more difficult if you have a positive reaction there to begin with, and vice versa. So overall, the well-being increased afterwards, and that's what we're after. So this BS minute, I think, is anything but BS, because it truly increases our serotonin levels as we work through the day, hour by hour or whatever. So the second thing I want to talk about is standing tall, is posturing for success. So we realize that the neurochemistry of both victory and defeat, or we can term it success or failure, can be very self-promoting, or it can be very self-defeating, often dependent on our postural flexion, which is our posture reaction to different types of things. So just like smiling increases our serotonin, a look up and stand tall posture with our shoulders back actually increases our serotonin levels. Okay, so if you don't believe me, just look at the two people looking there. Who do you think feels better about themselves, and who are you going to feel better about? So serotonin drops when we feel defeated, our posture drops, we start looking down, we might feel threatened or hurt, anxious, or weak. But we've seen people walk around with their shoulders dropping or their head dropped. So if you want to truly lower your attitude and lower your social status, just simply lower your posture and it'll work automatically. Okay, so the other thing you might want to think about doing is a 2-minute, what I call the power pose, or you look like the Incredible Hulk, and maybe even a little grunt going with it, because we know that that power pose will increase serotonin levels, it'll increase testosterone levels, and actually decrease that stress hormone again, that cortisol. So how do we truly take care of ourselves and take care of our perspective situation in life? I'm going to talk about some people, because we all know some people who take better care of their pets, their crops, their livestock than they take care of themselves. In fact, sometimes I think they're their own worst employee working for themselves, or they're their own worst boss if they're working for themselves to try to get themselves the best person they can be. Some people, they wallow in self-pity, and even when things are good, it's just a negative attitude that they carry in life that sometimes they're stuck in that rut, that protective mode, and they can't get out of it, and they spend a lifetime there. Some people treat others with more respect than themselves. Again, it's their perspective situation in life, thinking my situation isn't near as good. Okay, so when we take a look at some people that amplify their suffering or they amplify their stress, sometimes they do it for attention and they brand it as injustice, whether it be the unfair markets, no respect in society or whatever. Some people refuse to strive to improve themselves. And as a psychologist, neutral is not good. As human beings, we need to be moving forward. We need to be progressing. So bottom line is, don't be these some people, because these some people, they are not happy no matter what. So the desire to improve is needed for progress. And in order for us to improve, we must have that desire, and we must admit that there is a problem that we need to try to work on. We must take responsibility, which is tough for some people to do, to take responsibility for their own life or for the problem. They want to try to be passive and blame it on everybody else. We also need to act accordingly, okay, to take that responsibility and act and get help if needed. So instead of being passive, we need to try to be very proactive in having desire, admitting, taking responsibility, acting, and getting help. So neutral, as I mentioned just before, is not associated with personal growth or happiness. We need to be moving somewhere at all times. So sometimes we might think we just need to work harder just to maintain the same level of success. Okay, so just keeping one's life or finances above water, that is moving forward. Okay, so we're going to step to the side a little bit to know the value of being versus doing things, because there's a mindset that has happened in people's lives just over the course of the last couple hundred years. The value of being on one side or the cost of doing things on the other. So moons ago, life was more about being and less about things and just doing. Okay, so how do we become more mindful? And sometimes it takes more of a margin of time to become more mindful and have mindfulness versus thingsfulness or doingness. Okay, so how do you make life more about being and less about doing and of things? So the value of being, to be versus to do, to take care of things. And again, this comes back to those time margins of time, energy, focus, attention, because when we're in that protective mode and we don't have these margins of time or whatever, we focus more on those short-term threats and pleasures. It gets our protective brain working, not the long-term vision, long-term happiness of that brain of higher reasoning. So anxiety and problems with health relationships often arise, so there's a lot of chaos in life. And that chaos sometimes gives us less time for being, because we have more time where we have to take care of things or put things in order. So again, human beings versus human doers, or tied to things within our lives. So farm to stress, okay, we have another session, we'll talk about grief at some point, but farm to stress is an experience when we sense loss. Okay, it could be future security, it could be our position or situation in life, tragedy might strike, we might lose a way of life, maybe a dream or something like that that we're taking a look at. So the bottom line is that maintain a sense of aim, direction, and control no matter what happens. And I know it's easier said than done, but it's possible. Okay, so people that have a larger why in life and those virtues of something larger than self, okay, seem to deal with problems in a more healthy and a more proactive way. Those that truly focus on self tend to have the most problems. So he whose life has a why, from the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, basically can bear almost any how. So know your why in life. Don't lose your why in life, because that's your hope in life. And when I work with people and they start losing their hope in life, that's when I truly, truly, truly become highly concerned. So we're going to take a look at brain health tied to heart health. So oxytocin, it's a bonding hormone, but as dairy farmers, we know this as the milk letdown hormone. So it fine-tunes close relationships, empathy, help, and support for people who cares about. Okay, so this oxytocin, you can actually feel it when you're milking cows, and the milk letdown, it's actually a positive thing in the human body as well, as you're working with the cows. So people don't realize that it's also a stress hormone that pumps out as much adrenaline when under stress, and it motivates us to seek support and tell somebody how we feel. And so under difficulty, it's truly our stress response, and that we can try to be surrounded by people who care. Okay, so I think that's a pretty important piece, because on the flip side of this, loneliness equates to smoking about 15 cigarettes a day. So we need to stay close to each other. This comes from a UK research. So oxytocin protects the body. It helps to strengthen and repair the heart. Feeling closer to others, more oxytocin is released. And so when we talk about our stress comfort zone, we can actually stretch that higher with resiliency if we have more oxytocin. Okay, again, that compassionate heart, those who spend time helping others, it can put us in a better mood, if you know what I mean. And so here's a happy tip: to do something for others when we feel bad about ourselves, okay, because research will show that it increases our happiness quite a bit. If we can also do something for the planet, but we don't increase our happiness near as much as if we're doing something for other people. And if we do that same stuff for ourselves, there was actually no benefit in this research project of doing something for ourselves. So if you want to be happy, help others. Okay, brain health, we also realize is tied to routine. So routine is necessary, especially for distressed people. It helps us make better decisions. Anxiety and depression, we can't hardly treat it with the sufferer that has unpredictable daily routines. And so in trying to mediate negative emotions, it's so tied to that cyclical daily biological rhythms that it's pretty important to us. So have routines in life, pretty important. Time each morning, start the daily routine. Okay, so protein and fat breakfast when we get up. Okay, it doesn't have to be right away when we get up, but try to do it before exercising or a lot of heavy work, because we can get these hyper insulin spikes from exercise, burning up a lot of these sugars. Okay, so Dr. Jordan Peterson just basically says don't eat simple carbs or simple sugars for breakfast. I say don't eat them all day, especially if they're added sugars or just a lot of processed carbs, because of that blood sugar spike. Okay, it can cause us to actually become psychologically unstable, and it can actually happen that all day, and that system cannot be reset until after we get more sleep. So the brain health is also tied to gut health. Okay, so heavily impacted by diet, to the point that we talk a lot about serotonin. That happiness hormone is 75% secreted by the gut, only 5% by the brain. So turn off the news while eating, because even mild stress during that process while you're eating can actually unbalance the gut microbial issues that you have, making us more vulnerable, okay, to have more of a nervous system feedback. So when we take a look at that gut feeling, it's more than a metaphor. So just millions and trillions of neurons and microbes in the gut. And it's basically, it helps us regulate mood and cognition. And so it goes both ways as it goes back and forth to know your gut feeling, because it's definitely cooperating with your brain. So we take a look at brain health being tied to added sugars and processed carbs. So the sugar that we eat in 7 hours is what a person in 1822 ate in 5 days. Okay, we're eating at least 3 times too much on average of sugar. So like cocaine, it's very addictive. That brain, when it receives that or any type of junk food, it releases dopamine, creating more receptors for dopamine and just making us crave it even more. Okay, so that extra sugar spikes the insulin levels, inflames the brain, and gives lower levels of nervous tissue growth and blocks the usage of fat storing cells. So we take a look at this key. We actually need to get that insulin level down to get that key in there to unlock the padlock so we can get into those fat storing cells so we can actually utilize the energy that's in them. Otherwise, what are we going to do? Become overweight. So high insulin converts that sugar into fat, but does not let the body use it unless we unlock it without those sugar and insulin spikes. So lowering sugar is undoubtedly the key to opening those fat cells. So leptin, a protein hormone, gives a signal for satiety. It means that we're full. That gets suppressed. And so we blindly eat more and more without feeling full. Okay, so one is often blind to the robber until one is robbed blind. It's a very fat truth. So distress causes high cortisol levels, causing cravings, pleasurable food intake, especially again, the added sugars, unprocessed carbs. Less sleep can also initiate that craving, spiking the insulin. So again, one is often blind to the robber until one is blind. It's a sugary truth as well. So natural brain health is also tied to smartphone use. I'm just going to go through this just as a little caution because maybe we don't see it quite as much in our generation, but the younger generation, I think, is heavily impacted by this. Okay, so dopamine rewards users with each like, each post, each search. Okay, it's like a slot machine. Okay, it's very addictive to us. Okay, so it can be addictive, providing excessive stimulation. It can increase our emotionality, which is not always a good thing, and decreases our real social interaction. Okay, it can actually move users into distress with the constant interruptions. Our brains are constantly interrupted with notifications, these dopamine releases every 3 to 5 minutes in some people, social stimulations, unending searches, okay, and the conjuring of both real and false spectacles of life. Okay, so these natural rhythms of the brain are interrupted every 6 to 12 minutes for most people, with many struggling to go even 10 minutes without checking their phone. Okay, so one is often blind to the robber until one is robbed blind. It's a smartphone truth as well. So those that are constantly connected are more stressed, they feel lonelier, they're more likely to experience depression or some kind of a sleep disorder. And regular use of social media can increase the likelihood of envy, depression, overuse can reduce performance, social interaction, the list goes on by increasing these stresses, especially in anxiety, depression, and other things. So we're using our phone to get this feel-good dopamine response. And we need more of it every time we get the same level of response. And then we find out it's just not there. So what happens is all this positive response, this dopamine, then we end up with a negative emotion, anxiety, depression, false reality, which compounds the problem. Okay, so don't let the family relationships hide behind the screens. So farm families, I think, might need a digital detox. Okay, so just be cautious in the family. Disable notifications, they need time off. It just steals attention from real moments at hand. Okay, so focus on the family before the phone. Smartphones also need their places. Okay, we realize the blue light inhibits melatonin. It reduces both quality and quantity of sleep, so at least get the blue light glasses. But the detox phrase here is out of sight, out of mind at night, hopefully. So smartphones are secondary relationships because raw dopamine and spontaneous conversation is changing in households, classrooms, and on the farm. And I can just see that when I walk into a classroom, about everybody's mindset is in their phone. You can't even have conversations with students hardly anymore just because it's become more of a struggle. And they don't even talk to their neighboring student anymore because they're on their phone all the time. Okay, but raw dopamine, face to face. So being bored, we look at young kids and how important being bored is, because it gives them a lot of creativity, because that being boredom tends them to think about different things that they can do and be more creative about it. So being bored is more important than checking this phone every 5 minutes. So behavioral health is also sometimes, you have these addictions or these cravings that we have that purge the urge to let the feeling pass. And so if you just take a deep breath, most emotions last 30, 60, sometimes up to 90 seconds. Okay, so just take that deep breath. You want that snack, but just take that deep breath and let those emotions pass and then just walk away. Okay, so sometimes we feel, a failure because we didn't do this or didn't do that. We feel guilty because we did grab that snack. Okay, but that actually encourages that behavior to behavior. So be easier on yourself. Hold the breath and be easier on yourself. Let the urge pass. Behavioral health is also tied to communication skill. I'm just going to go through this real quickly. Others don't think and feel the same way. Some people have a hard time realizing that there's different personalities. They don't think the same way and they don't feel the same way because of different values. They have the values, and whether they're right or wrong, there are different values out there. If we're glued to our point of view, it's very difficult because we're in that protective mode to see the other person's point of view. Anger tends to come from that protective mode, truly skews another person's view. Positive feelings change a person's reality, hopefully to the positive. When we take a look at negative feelings, they also change people's reality. So when we get distressed, those expressions of care and empathy are not near as effective or genuine if we're just in that stress mode. Okay, so we move beyond into distress, we're not as effective. So active listening does not guarantee that the message was received correctly. There's a big or a lot of distress that happens because we don't listen well enough and we don't communicate back and try to understand what was said by that message. And when we take a look at using phones and text messaging, okay, definitely does not get the same message across compared to face. Our emotions transfer very quickly to one another. So our negativity can quickly transfer to the spouse and to the kids. And so watch those negative emotions because they definitely transfer. And on the flip side, use your smile, use your laugh, because that is very contagious and transfers very quickly as well. And judging others' emotions and their intentions is often a faulty judgment. We do this with spouses, we do this with kids. We judge their emotions and their intentions without truly knowing. It goes back to this listening skill as well. So the skill is to think good, well-wishing thoughts to those that you meet. This was actually a research project. When people wanted to feel better about themselves, they actually showed that people felt better. They increased the joy in their life by everybody that they walked by wishing them well. Okay, not even verbalizing, but just thinking it in their mind. So be mindful of the present as we start summarizing: to breathe, to smile, stand tall, take care of yourself and have respect for yourself, for who you are and what you do. Be proactive and responsible for ourselves and for our life, and realize that life's value goes well beyond the farm. Okay, there's a higher virtue. Leave the pity parties to attend to higher virtues and higher values. Swap processed carbs and added sugars out of your diet as best you can. Don't let the screen time deplete your dream time or your bored time. And generosity, gratitude, they increase the happy hormones. Okay, and I've actually took a situation where I kind of practice what I preach. I try to detox myself from this phone. I use it for work. Don't use it for social media anymore at all. I take a lot of notifications and things like that, but for work and for some family things, I will still use it. The sugar detox and the processed carb detox has been very beneficial. When people do that, they don't feel near the amount of anxiety that they tend to feel. And when you take a look at generosity and gratitude with those happy hormones, to really focus on other people and their situations in life and what we can do to try to help them, really increases our happiness as well. So managing farm distress, again, the big key is to realize that stress can be good and it is good, okay, within a comfort zone. But once it gets beyond that comfort zone and gets into distress, that's when we need to be concerned. Okay, so there are a lot of things that we can and should pursue in our brain health and our behavioral well-being. And at this time, we'll just let it open for questions and comments if you have them. But thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Larry. We got a couple of questions here. How important or what's the problem with an inflexible schedule? Get up, same time, do this the same way. Is there a problem with that?
So with a flexible schedule, I think it really depends on your resiliency. But I think a lot of people are a lot more adept to having flexible schedules, or some that really need the rigidity. I think part of the issue is that when we start taking a look at the thought process of people that suffer from anxiety and depression, okay, then it's when we start taking a look that we really need more of, because a lot of them are suffering from a lot of chaos in their lives, and they kind of need some rigidity and some structure into their lives, and that's probably the thought process. But for most people that are dealing with, healthier mindsets that may not suffer from that, that flexibility probably is a resiliency learned skill that you probably tend to have.
Very good. How much is our culture of masking up adding to our general stress?
Well, if you ever, when I'm walking down the street or if I'm in a restaurant or something like that and I'm smiling at somebody, they don't even know. Okay, so I just think there's a lot of emotions that are hid behind, and we take a look at a lot of our, communication is actually so much nonverbal. Sometimes 65, 70, 85% of our communication, depending on the topic, is actually nonverbal. And now we put this mask on, and I think we take away a lot of it. So I think that culture has definitely changed with this masking. That whole concept of social distancing has reduced, people's oxytocin levels, just their ability to feel closer, be more supported. And, we can talk about the digital detox as well. But if it wasn't for some of the digital type things that we're doing with Zoom and things like that, a lot of less get togethers, parents and grandkids and things like that are working with it. But yeah, that masking up has definitely changed us. And so, as hopefully at some point in time when this goes by, we can kind of get back to normal. But I think our normal is going to be a new normal.
Larry, how important is sleep, getting enough sleep for us?
Um, People would actually put that probably as the number one thing. I probably should have talked about it a little bit more, but that sleep deprivation gets into so much of our mindset. I mean, it can actually reduce our serotonin levels. First of all, it increases our irritability and just it impacts our relationships. And anytime we get less sleep and we start feeling, more anxiety, this, that, or the other thing, we're probably in more protective mode because that time, the margin of time has actually been reduced in our lives. And so we kind of get ourselves again more in that protective mode. And so it it actually gets into, I would say, just about every facet of brain health is so tied. We can say it gets tied to the gut, but it really does get tied because of our lack of sleep. And so when people are starting to get less, and I know farmers, we go through this all the time, and I've been guilty of it myself, there's things we just got to get done. And sometimes we have to work through the night to get things done because the rain's coming the next day and we need to get this into the ground. So I realize that's an issue, but anytime we go through high periods of stress, it's, I think, sometimes pretty imperative that we try to take about the same number of days or the same number of hours to try to detox from the stress as well.
Yeah, final question. You'd mentioned cortisol. Are there physical health issues with cortisol?
Okay, so all these emotions and all these hormones are actually good. They're there for a reason to help protect us. But the issue is when they get beyond control. Okay, so if we look at a person and look at their brain that's under high levels of cortisol for long periods of time, so they're actually under chronic stress, their brain receptors will actually start to become, their nerve endings will actually start to become damaged. Okay, so that means that things don't flow through the brain quite as well when we start taking a look at things like that. So those high levels of cortisol, yeah, especially as they become in a chronic stage, and a lot of chronic stress are very, very damaging to the brain and the thought process, decision making abilities, no doubt.